Right, folks. Any questions from the floor? Yeah.
Excuse me. It's for Maria, really.
Okay.
But the question was partially answered by Ed, I think. You quite rightly mentioned that the dialogue shouldn't just be between the educational elite, the cosmopolitan. And you mentioned the phrase grassroots movements, and debate, being driven from below. But it's the same old problem. How do you get the people who really need to be in the debate? And I'm thinking about someone who's got a full-time job, probably paid below the minimum wage, can't feed the family properly, can't afford the bus fare to go to a debate about anything. And I'll give you an example of someone who I met not that long ago. She's an assistant at a funeral parlour, and I met her just, saying hello, how are you, a couple of times. And the third time I went in there to her place of work, she got the most awful cold. And I said the usual thing, poor you look awful. And she said, yes, I've got flu. And I said, oh dear, you really ought to be at home then, keep warm. And she really turned on me, quite rightly actually, but she really turned on me and said, don't you think if I could be warm at home, if I could put the heating on, don't you think that's where I'd be, not here at work, where I can't cope? I'm giving my germs to everybody else. She couldn't have the heating on at home. And I mean, she was in her mid-40s. And I know by then she was a single parent.
So how do we make debate successful?
People
my answer.
who can't afford
That's the biggest
basics
challenge.
like bus fares.
Right.
And these are people we need to have in the debate.
Yes, that's the biggest challenge, and I don't have a solution. I've got some ideas. Since the welfare state is being undermined and destroyed, what we need is a welfare society. And I think this links to something that Ruth mentioned earlier. I think British society, which is more collectivist than the US, is becoming more individualized. And I think it's individualism, the fact that you don't speak to your neighbor, that we don't have a welfare society where people speak to each other. For example, we were mentioning a mother who has children. She can't be here because she has children. If she had a strong connection with the neighbors, maybe the neighbors could babysit and she could be here. So maybe, there needs to be a sea of change in society, and what we need is a welfare society where we all help each other and more solidarity. But that's the biggest challenge we face, to create a grassroots culture. But I think people like you could start, and probably are doing already a lot in terms of building, a society that is not just about going to work, coming back home and not seeing everyone. But that's absolutely the biggest challenge, and I totally agree with you. I talk to academics, and I much rather prefer to speak to people like you sometimes than to academics where the debates are rather all the same in a way.
I mean, it's part of the problem at the death of the public meeting.
Yes.
Despite some of our best efforts.
I stood in Hampstead and Kilburn in the general election in 2010. You couldn't get two more disparate communities clubbed together by a boundary commission. And if you went to NW3 Hampstead and listened to the debate on policing, you would think you lived in the centre of scum and villainy, because everything was about the 4x4 car crime crisis, where 3 cars had been hit. Whereas if you went to NW6 Kilburn, there wouldn't be anyone turning up at the meetings, or not enough, and there'd be 6 police and they'd be ready for a presentation, and the debate would be thin. Because of my work, I have a travel card, my Oyster card. I pay, it's about £1,300 a year, and I just get on the bus and train and I got free access, therefore once that's paid for. But what I see, because I get on the bus quicker, therefore, is the very people who can't afford the card counting out the pennies from their purses. And I happened to be at a discussion with Christian Walmart, who's a good transport expert in London, and I said to him, I wonder if I'm happy to pay for the convenience of not having to carry cash and just swiping my way through as a suited professional in the morning in a rush, trying to ignore everybody. But actually, whether we now need a bus fare or a train fare that is so cheap that people with cash can pay for it, instead of having to count it out. Because actually what I'm seeing is a set of largely mums struggling with that moment of do they get on the bus or do they walk? And they're invariably with a pram, invariably with too many bags of shopping. You know, I just watch and just, you know, it's just not nice to see. And actually I'm fairly unusual enough to get the bus, because actually most people suited in a hurry in the morning will get the tube because it's quicker and it's slightly more anonymous and more aggressive, and it gets them there faster. I think there's a responsibility on those of us that do turn up to meetings to make sure we think about the people who don't. And I realise it risks people looking down, but I think actually we need to put ourselves in the place of, what if I didn't have my swipe through card or my credit card? Because the reason why people don't know how much a pint of milk costs is because it's just on their credit card bill at the end of the shop. Whereas the people who do know what a pint of milk costs, which is used to be a sort of test for politicians, are the people who stand there and count it out of their purse. And I just wonder whether we've lost sight of what people have to do day to day, which is pay the heating and pay the bills, pay the bus fares. And I don't know the answers to that, but I wonder if we could have a system that actually supported and enabled people to access it all, rather than just, I'm fine, why don't you raise yourself up?
Ruth, any thoughts on how we widen access to this whole debate?
It is very difficult, and I think you put your finger on a really important aspect of it. And we mustn't make it like another demand on people like the woman you were talking about. You know, why aren't you kind of going to public meetings and everything on top of everything else? And that's a slight danger. But I think if, you know, things have to, I mean, there's no point just having meetings in the centre of cities if you want people who can't afford bus fares and things to go to them. It means people going out into estates and so forth and trying to have meetings there. But we shouldn't also ignore the extent to which some people, despite hardship and poverty, do get organised. I mean, I think, you know, the lone mothers in London who've got organised around their housing rights, they may not have used the language of human rights, but that's what they were fighting for, and very successfully, and they got amazing publicity, and they knew how to use it. And there are, I mean, actually sometimes sort of networks in some of the poorest areas can be quite strong, people looking after each other's children and so forth. And that's one of the reasons why policies like the bedroom tax and the benefit cap are so iniquitous, because on the one hand, you know, the government says, oh, we want to, you know, big society, strengthen, you know, social bonds and everything, and then their policies are breaking them up. And then people become more atomised, and then it's even less likely that they can then get organised, because they haven't got anyone else. They're pushed out of, you know, central London into outer London, or from outer London to Birmingham or wherever, and they won't know anyone. So it makes it even harder to get organised. So, but I don't. I mean, I'm not sure I'd put it down to the dearth of the. I mean, actually, what was amazing about, I mean, what everyone thinks, you know, about Jeremy Corbyn, but the meetings, I mean, I went to one in Nottingham, and it was called at less than a week's notice, and about 1,300 people turned up. 300 had to be addressed outside. There was 1,000 in the hall. I mean, it was just, and that was being replicated all over the country. So if someone is able to generate the enthusiasm, then actually people, it would seem, are prepared to go to public meetings. It's just that most politicians don't generate that kind of enthusiasm. So what can we learn from that? How can we build on that?
I think it's no accident that they're now terrified of the new media, the established media, because that's exactly how it was done.
Yeah.
It was done by, you know, completely anarchically in many respects.
Very disturbing division that I've identified, the bread and roses in particular. The language of compassion, the language of humanity is softer, less insistent, and doesn't accumulate capital like the language of business and success in business. And if we're going to emphasise business above everything else, then we've got to work on how you emphasise humanity as well. This is coming up in other areas as well. I'm particularly interested in relationships between the communities in Leicester, the different religious communities. There have recently come out 2 books that warn against the legalisation of religious freedom to the extent that it erects barriers that people stand behind and attack one another from, rather than bring them together to share their human concerns. And I think this is a very serious matter. It relates back to the impact of the young child on the beach. That gets through, but only temporarily. And this, I feel, is something that we need to work on. It's allied to our adversarial approach to just about everything in this country that goes way back. We must get back to what it means for human beings to live together, the concept that we are human beings.
Just very quickly then.
Yes, what I wanted to say, I totally agree with you. And I want to say that I don't know, I expect many of you have read Owen Jones's book, but one of the things that hit me about Owen Jones's book is when he said, this has been a long-term project. This changing to the kind of society that you're talking about. We talk about it as though it's just happened, or that it's in kind of recent memory. But the kind of change, I'm sounding like a conspiracy theorist, and I don't mean to be one by saying this, but the change of public values has not been something that's just happened overnight, and that it's multiple and it's in so many different areas. You know, has been a long-term project. I think that's the phrase that Owen Jones used, and I think it's a good one. And we're mistaken to think it's something that's just happened. And
in fact, Owen Jones gets widely derided for daring to challenge the prevailing orthodoxies. Ed?
Should we just let more people come in?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
go on. And anyone else wants to? And then they can respond to various. Yeah.
Yes, this is really a comment to Ruth. When the coalition government came in 2010, my memory is that David Cameron was saying that there would be cuts to social security, but that the disabled would be protected. But it seems that this hasn't happened. That disability living allowance and those sort of benefits have been cut, the carers allowance isn't part of the benefit cap, and there's all sorts of ways in which, as you said, the disabled have been affected. Am I right in thinking that he said that the disabled would be protected? Why isn't the Labour Party going back and challenging him, if I'm right, and saying, yes, you said you'd protect the disabled, but you haven't?
Do you want me to answer this? I mean, they continue to say they are, and up to a degree they are, in that some of the cuts are not applying to some of the benefits disabled people get, and that's how they get away with it. But it's not all the benefits or services that disabled people get. So actually there have been very severe cuts, and to be fair, I mean, Labour has, I think in the Commons, consistently been pushing on this and pushing this argument for a cumulative impact assessment of the cuts, the impact of the cuts on disabled people, and getting nowhere. But it's, I mean, politicians have weaselly ways of kind of saying things and then saying, oh, but we didn't cut this benefit or that benefit, and then ignoring those that they did cut. So that's how they get away with it, I'm afraid. Plus, I mean, but the good side of it, and this actually coming back to the thing about social media, is the disabled people's movement is probably one of the most active movements in opposition to a lot of these cuts. And they've done it through social media. I mean, social media, for people who actually can't physically move around perhaps as much as some other people can. And we're not talking about all disabled people, because it's not all about physical disabilities. But I mean, it's been a wonderful vehicle for disabled people to organise together, and they've been very effective in terms of lobbying through email and so forth, Parliament and everything. So it's and they've been very effective actually in drawing attention to the impact of many of these cuts.
So Ed, could I come to you to maybe reflect on what was just being said there about use of language and adversarial politics, and just remembering that actually all of this is about human beings ultimately, and we can sometimes forget about that.
Well, to agree with Ruth in putting down the notion of big society, when that all popped up, I just sort of groaned within myself, because it felt like code for if you're up to it, do it yourself. And we're pulling out. And I think one of the, in all of the cuts that go on, I've worked in local government for years, and I just see local government being cut away at the knees, not just at its money, but at what it could do. And actually, some of the most amazing stuff that goes on is facilitated by local government with those libraries and those other local facilities. But in terms of the language, the one that I don't think I even really spoke up at the time or really reacted, but the one I really struggle with is hard-working families.
Oh God!
I just don't know who isn't in that definition. Yeah. But it's this notion, and actually I'm fascinated by American politics, largely how awful it is. But there I see them charging around, fighting for their middle classes, and it just fills me with dread that actually that's just a prediction of where we're going in. I would say, however, by one note of optimism, I think actually the opportunity to be involved in something is greater than it's ever been. My dilemma is not whether to go to a meeting, but which one to go to. I think actually I see more volunteering, more activism than certainly my parents were involved in, and that may not be a fair parallel. But actually, the refugee crisis did trigger people in churches, interestingly, setting up, collecting sleeping bags and food and access and so on. I'm not depressed about it. What depresses me is the government's response to it, which is, oh, well, if you're volunteering to do it, we need to enable it as a state. Actually, what the people are demonstrating is that it's a need, therefore you should step up. Whether that's enabling local government to fill that gap or the social services to support that net to exist in a stronger and more equitable way. Because what I loathe about postcode lottery is actually you end up with some good places and lots of bad places.
I would just like to respond to your comments, and actually when I was preparing this talk I had to shorten it, and I had something which would, respond to what you were saying. I think what happens with the austerity agenda is that economic values explain everything and justify everything, and this is part of economic development, such as what we call neoliberalism. So that's what is the orthodox. So economic values, the idea that we are all entrepreneurial subjects, winners and losers. And I think that is a big problem. So the language of compassion and humanity you are talking about, I think it can be supported by the human rights regime. So what we have here is a sharp opposition between a language of compassion and humanity, which the human rights regime supports, and the language of business, which is the language that uses economic values to justify all the decisions that are made in terms of budget cuts. How we make the language of human rights relevant to what we do and how governments make decisions about, public spending. So they shouldn't be placed in opposition, they should come together. And at the moment, economic values are winning. And how we fight that? How do we fight that? This is a big problem.
Business lends itself to analysis and digitization, shall we say, whereas human values have got to be communicated in other words.
Yeah.
As most of you know, I work for an organisation called City of Sanctuary. That actually is the reason I'm here, because some of the proceeds of this festival as a whole are coming to us. And I was asked to come and talk about what we do, but I think most people know, so I'm not going to do that. But I am going to use the fact that I work with asylum seekers and refugees to make a point. And that is that there is a huge disconnect between outpourings of sympathy and what actually happens. There's this enormous disconnect between people wanting to help and seeing these images of little Alan Kurdi and people beside barbed wire fences and so on, and actually governments putting up those barbed wire fences, and governments that should be protesting and saying, for heaven's sake, no, this is infringing people's human rights. I haven't noticed anybody in Europe saying this is a bad thing at the governmental level. So I think you've got that disconnect. And I think you've also got another very big disconnect, which is between us, people who think about austerity and human rights and concern and compassion for others. City of Sanctuary had a big event in Parliament on Tuesday, in fact, and I had a report from one of our members who was there, and he made what I thought was quite an interesting point, because part of the time some of the delegates had also spent time listening to the debate on the immigration bill, and he said it was notable that the people speaking against the bill, those MPs speaking against the bill, all of them came from rural constituencies where there were no immigrants to worry about. And I think we've also got a big disconnect between agendas, different agendas within our society.
Okay, that's great. So you had a question as well? We'll take a couple.
Yeah, I'll just, well, I've got loads of things spinning my head from all this, but just one thing. I'd like to ask if we couldn't look at what we call economic values in a rather different way, because in fact what we're talking about, all this human rights and austerity, that's all about economics. It's about people having the means to live a decent and rich and fulfilled life, and that depends on them having the material resources to do so. If they have that, if they have stuff to eat, if they can warm their homes, if they can take a day off when they're sick and all the rest of it, if all of that is there, then they can start to begin to develop as people and start to come to meetings and discuss their human rights.
Yep.
But without those things they can't. And I think that we've been bamboozled and misled into thinking that economics is something about money, and particularly about high finance, and it's not. Economics is about the producing the means that we live by and distributing it, and it's how we choose to do that.
Okay.
And so that's my point really. That we shouldn't throw out talk of economics, but we should think about what the purpose of having economics is.
Okay, and one final question. I must admit, I saw the first.
I just wanted to say something about how we can bring more people to solidarity movements and grassroots movements. So I believe that these movements should create some structures that society has lost. And what I mean with this is that I come from a country where the welfare state has collapsed. So while working with a solidarity group with refugees, I found out that these people had already created a health structure, a self-organized health structure, an education structure, and they also provided food to people who didn't have the money to have it. And what I've seen through the summer was that because people could actually go there and get the things they needed, they found that their time, their precious time, was was worth distributed there. So people who, and people like me, because I was unemployed and I couldn't get to a doctor. So if I could use the facilities there, of course I would give some of my time. Because, like you said, you can't expect people to leave all their stresses and all their worries aside and say, yes, I will come. But if, in a way, you can construct a community within the community, then maybe this is what solidarity is about. This is what distinguishes that from charity.
Okay, thank you. So if we can respond to any of those comments and any closing comments as well, because these will be our final comments. So Maria first.
Yes, I would like to respond to your comments and just to clarify what I meant by economic values. I think there are two types of economic values we are talking about. What the economic values you are talking about are values associated with redistributive policies, where the wealth is fairly distributed to everyone, and that's of course about economics. But the economic values that are sanctioned by the current government, and well, not just the current government, but more generally by what we call neoliberalism, they're different values. They're those values that support the idea that we are all entrepreneurial subjects and life is about winning, there's winners and losers. And that those are the economic values that I think are problematic. I totally agree that we should move towards a fairer society where redistributive policies and values like the ones you are talking about are made more central. So, you know, just to make a distinction, I totally agree with you.
Ruth?
Yeah, I mean, just on that question, and I think there have been some really good points made, and just the question about the purpose of economics, and it goes back to the point you made as well. And Mathew said we're both involved in this organisation called Compass, and it's called Compass for a Good Society. And for me, part of the problem with neoliberalism is that economics is put on a pedestal, as all about everything is seen through the prism of economics at that level. But for me, economics at that level it's a means to an end, and the end is a good society in which people can live a good life and can flourish. And to do that, they need decent, basic standard of living. And in a sense, what you said illustrated beautifully the point I made in my introduction about the indivisibility of human rights. And that we need those economic and social rights in order to be able to go out and flourish and go to political meetings and really enjoy our civil rights and so forth. And just finally, the point that you made about the importance of solidarity is not we don't talk the language of solidarity very much these days, but I think it's a really important language. And it's not just about solidarity with people like us, but more important, it's about solidarity with people not like us. And that, I think, really is, in a sense, the City of Sanctuaries movement is an example of solidarity in action, and I very much applaud it.
Well, I'm certainly scared by the development of the language, because the economy has become everything. And if you translate that and look across to America, actually even the word liberal in America has become a negative. Whereas in the year of the Great Deal, liberal was the driving force that enabled it. So that scares me a bit. Growing up in South Lincolnshire has affected me more than I realised, and I appreciate it more and more over the years. And there's a growing, I think what Mathew characterises as a UKIP vote, but actually it's a very subtle and dominant racism lying there. And I just spend quite a bit of time talking to my contemporaries and other friends and neighbours and my parents, and just saying, the Poles and Eastern Europeans have arrived now. Before them it was the Irish, and before them it was the Belgians, and before them it was the Huguenots, and before them it was the Dutch. And actually, isn't that great? Because that's why your grand's Irish and your grand's got French roots and so on. But actually, people are sort of in denial about the past of what's gone on and what is England. We've got this notion, I think, of an island state, and I don't have much truck with it. And just on a final point, hopefully to illustrate that, I sometimes, living in London where it is so multicultural, I was talking to my dad and I said, slightly jokingly, I said, I'm trying to learn Urdu and Hindi, but I'm really not very good at it. He said, oh wow, that's quite impressive. And I said, well, the reverse of that is actually my taxi driver does speak Urdu and does speak English, and he's trying to learn English, but he's not very good at it. And we say, God, why doesn't he learn English? Actually, if I learned a bit of Urdu and a bit of Hindi, we'd be quite impressed. but when he doesn't speak brilliant English, he shouldn't be here. And I just worry that with the dominance of the economic language, actually under there is a fairly unpleasant social phenomena. And I just think that maybe those of us that come to meetings have got to go out and try and challenge that, because actually the economy enables things, but society is far more interesting and far richer than just the economy.
Ladies and gentlemen, please thank our panel. Now, I used to want to say something more about seekers of...
I'm going to have to go.
No, I think everybody knows what we do. All I'd like to say is, anybody whose money has come our way, thank you.
Thanks very much, and the festival goes on until the 10th, so I hope you get to some of the more events as well. It's all online. Thanks very much.